Today we're going to do a warband review, and although I'm going to focus on the Horns of Hashut, this is a process you can take when looking at any warband. In an earlier video, we looked at the basics of putting a warband together, so stuff like 1 leader, 2 allies, 3 trolls, etc. If you're completely new to building a warband, check out that video first. Due to a viewer request, we're looking at the Horns of Hashut. This warband came in the Heart of Gur starter box, but you can now pick it up on their own. Hashut is the god of fire and darkness, typically associated with chaos dwarfs. The Horns of Hashut are the forward scouts, the vanguard for the dwarven legions. So that explains the flame hurler and the ash bombs. Images of Hashut have him with bull-like horns. The bull centaur is featured heavily in the old chaos dwarf line, which does explain the helmets. The warband comes with 10 fighters in total, a Ruinator Alpha as the leader, 1 Ruinator, 5 Demolishers, including 1 with a Flame Hurler, and 3 Shatterers. When putting together a warband, it's good to ask ourselves, how is this warband unique? What's special about them? The first thing I like to do is to take a look at the numbers and compare them to other fighters. For this I use scatter plots, showing damage and wounds versus points. I've talked about this before in the Understanding Fighter Characteristics videos and others, but the version here is a dashboard that you can play around with yourself. Link for it is in the description. Comparing your fighters to the entire pool is important, as the numbers by themselves don't really tell you that much. Here we've selected the Horns of Hashut warband. Each of the fighters appear as a darker dot that you can hover over to see the name. For this video I've added labels to make that a little bit easier. The most expensive model in this warband is the Ruinator Alpha. At 165 points, some of the more elite warbands would consider to be a cheap model. We can see a few of the fighters have 2 options. That will either be where there are 2 weapon profiles you can choose from, or where there's ranged and a melee option. That very low damage dot around 125 is the melee option for the Flame Hurler, for example. So what can we see from this? Well, the Shatterer is looking really good. It's near the top for the 55 point cost. The Demolisher is pretty average damage, certainly not bad, but not near the top. The Ruinator is near the top at 125 point range, but if you look left, you can see that from about 180 to 125, the damage is relatively flat. The most efficient fighters will be at the first peak of those steps. So while the Ruinator is doing good damage compared to other 125 point models, you can get cheaper models doing the same damage. The Ruinator Alpha sits at a similar damage to the Ruinator, but hopefully has a few more advantages. To get a better idea of the Flame Hurler, we've changed the selection here to range 6+ fighters. So we can see the Flame Hurler is relatively competitive when it comes to range attacks. The majority of the cheap range attacks are in the Caradron Overlords, and if you exclude those, then the Flame Hurler is actually sitting in a pretty good spot. Looking over the wounds, we can see that the Ruinators and Demolishers are probably a little below average, especially when you pay the extra for the Flame Hurler. The Shatterer, on the other hand, is looking pretty good. Now, this isn't taking toughness into account, so if we see high toughness in Demolishers and low toughness on the Shatterers, then that would change things slightly. Of course, looking at the numbers in a vacuum does not give us an accurate reflection of what's going on. We should also spend some time looking at the abilities. There are 4 abilities that are core to this warband: a reaction, 2 doubles, and a triple. Of those, 3 require the Warrior rune mark, which, as we'll see later, everyone in this warband except the Shatterer has. So out of these 4, the Shatterer can only use the Merciless Cruelty. A lot of abilities in this game are damage focused, often with a few hoops to jump through to get through to the final actual damage. When looking at abilities like this, it is always worthwhile working out what the average damage is. So personally, I always calculate it versus toughness 4 targets, but you might find recalculating against different targets might be useful. Looking at Stampede of Iron, for example, this is a pretty standard charge ability that we see across many warbands. You roll 1 dice, and on a 4+, you do 1 damage. On a 6, that damage is instead the ability's value. So best case scenario, we have a double 6. On a 1 to 3, we do 0 damage. On a 4 to 5, we do 1 damage. And on a 6, we do 6 damage. We can map out that dice roll, add up all the damage, so that's 8 in total, divide by the number of sides on the dice, which is 6, which will give us the average damage. So in this case, it's a mere 1.3 damage. Now obviously that has highs and lows. You could get that 1, you could get that 0, or you could get a big 6. The default to compare a double ability against is Onslaught, which will give an extra attack dice to a melee action. So depending on the fighter, there will be cases where Stampede of Iron will be useful, and it's worth mapping out those cases ahead of time. When looking at reactions, we also need to factor in the cost of an action. For many reactions, you're only going to use them if it looks like your fighter is about to go down, since getting any sort of activation now is better than nothing. Also, you have to factor in that during narrative play, you'll have those points renown, which will let you activate reactions without spending an action. So often in match play, where you don't have that option, reactions seem a little weak. In this case, the Breath of Cinder and Smoke ability might do a little damage and might reduce the target's strength. Interestingly, you can stack this with multiple fighters reacting to try bring the target's strength down further. It is random though, and as it's locked into the higher cost warriors, the loss of an action is big. But it could have a lot of utilities in situations like holding an objective, where you're lucky to tank through some damage. Losing one strength typically means, on average, they're doing one less damage. Although, once the strength is under the toughness of your defending fighter, any more won't make any difference. Last, for abilities, I want to talk about triples and to a certain extent quads. At the bottom we have a bunch of dice. Ignore the numbers on them. What we're interested in is the chance of getting doubles, triples and quads. The chance of a quad is about 5%, so pretty unreliable. The chance of a triple is around 30%, so doubles are going to be your bread and butter. Now, that wild dice will let you upgrade your dice. We can only upgrade a set of dice once, so you can't take a double and take 2 wild dice to turn into a quad. This means you can rely on having access to a triple every turn. The universal triple abilities are Respite and Inspiring Presence, both powerful abilities that have won games for me. They are not abilities that you'll use every turn, unlike say the double Onslaught. So the triple for your Warband really becomes a signature ability. You've got a good chance of popping it every turn, and it should have an impact. The triple for Horns of Hashut is Ash Bomb. It has a 6-inch range and sets up a token. Enemy fighters within 3 inches of that token lose 1 attack dice and 1 toughness. So you're reducing their damage and potentially increasing your own. As the token is static, this does mean they can just walk away from it, but if they're already locked in combat, or have already acted this round, that's less of an issue. In comparison to other triples, Ash Bomb lacks the raw power of others, but the combination of offense and defense at the same time is very rare, and in a key fight between 2 leaders for example, Ash Bomb has the potential to win games. Okay, we've looked at some, but not all of the abilities for this Warband. Next thing we're going to do is focus on each of the fighter options, starting with the leader. The Ruinator Alpha can be built in 2 different ways, either with a Warband or a Heavy Flail. You can see they're the exact same points and are identical apart from the weapon profiles. If we look at average damage, then we can see the Flail wins out. I suspect the reason for this is the designers are valuing the higher crit of 5 in combination with the ability Lay to Waste, where you could crit in 5s as well as on 6s. It's easy enough to work out the numbers though. Against T4, the average damage will be moved from 4.5 to 6 for the Bident, and from 5.3 to 6.6 for the Heavy Flail. So even with this ability, the Heavy Flail is better. Worse still, just getting an extra dice with Onslaught brings the Heavy Flail to 6.9, so we'll stick with the Heavy Flail and the universal ability Onslaught instead. Looking over the fighter, at 165, it's in a mid-range, which makes him a relatively interesting fighter as a leader. He's not going to be an enemy leader killer, but we can also get an ally to fill that role if needed. My baseline in a fighter is 4 move, 4 toughness, 3 wounds per 25 points, and 1 damage per 25 points. So everything but the damage is about what I'm looking for. We have damage of 5.3, but we were hoping to be closer to 6.6 versus T4, although we are at that for T3, which is nice. We are getting reach 2 on this fighter, which is great to see. There is a quad that is specific to the Ruinator Alpha. I'm not going to read it out, but I would recommend ignoring all quads until you have the Warband together. Look at all the quad options you have and work out when they would be better than a Rampage, which is still the gold standard. Next we have the Ruinator, who is very similar to the Alpha but 40 points cheaper. 5 less wounds and loses the reach. That last part is the kicker. If we still had that reach 2, this fighter would be fantastic. Still, the damage is over the 5 we'd be looking for at this point. So that's really good, and everything else is on target. So I'm happy enough that this is a solid fighter. Next we have the Demolisher, who comes in 2 forms, with shields or with 2 weapons. Shield gets you 5 armor, while the 2 weapons brings the average damage up to the expected 4. Again, this is a solid but uninspiring fighter. The 2 weapon variety certainly ticks all the boxes I'm looking for in a fighter. Maybe 5 more points than I'd hope, but that's just because all my hopes and dreams are in 25 point segments. Whether 5 armor is worth it or not depends on your own meta. Due to the way toughness and strength interact, there's a bit of a meta game with them. If in doubt, always go with more damage. Last out of the warriors we have the Flame Hurler. As we saw earlier in the plots, this is actually one of the best range fighters in Chaos, and is competitive with the Caradhran Overlords, who essentially have the monopoly. It is only range 6 though, and as the fighter only had the weapon swapped and the points increased, the wounds are much lower than expected. That said, 2 of these are going to be able to dump on average 16 damage on a target within 6 inches of them, so you could get a lot of work done with that. As it is a ranged attack, they can't target enemies who get into melee with another friendly fighter, but thankfully the new FAQ does give them the option to still target enemies within 3 inches of them, even if they are melee. As ranged fighters, they cannot use Onslaught, so here the Merciless Cruelty double is a pretty nice option to have. Although it is only for one attack, and only works if they've already taken that damage requirement. The Flame Hurler then is probably your best candidate for Ash Bomb, although due to the high strength of the Flame Hurler, they will only benefit themselves if the target is 5, 6, or 7 toughness. That however will free up the doubles for use with your melee fighters, letting them get extra benefits from both abilities. Last up we have the Shatterer, who really is the star of this warband. For 50 points, we're expecting 6 wounds and 2 damage. We're getting 10 wounds and 2.5 damage, along with a reach of 2. If you pull up that dashboard and play around, you will find that there are very few cheap fighters with reach 2, and they're typically 3 move, so the Shatterer having all of this and 4 move is quite big. The only downside is that toughness of 3, but of all the possible problems, that one's not really so bad. The Shatterer has no rune marks and notably lacks the Warrior rune mark, so no Breath of Cinder and Smoke reaction, and although they can benefit from the Ash Bomb, the Shatterers cannot throw it. So we've highlighted 3 potential strengths for this warband. First is a Demolisher with Flame Hurler, a little bit more expensive than we like, and doesn't compare well against the Kharadron Overlords, but within Chaos this is probably one of the better ranged fighters around. I think this is something worth playing with, testing out, and then making a judgment afterwards. The Shatterer, on the other hand, is definitely the strongest element in this list. It's got good stats and damage for very few points, and that reach 2 really sets it apart. If nothing else, I would be happy to build a warband completely out of Shatterers. Last, the Ash Bomb. The ability selection for this warband hasn't been very exciting, but we can get the Ash Bomb up every turn, debuffing a target and buffing all attacks against them, letting us pick off key enemy units in relative safety. Okay, so what next? So we've got a bit of a better idea of what the warband is looking like. Luckily this is one of the bespoke warbands, so there aren't a lot of fighters to get through. Bespoke just means made for a specific person, normally talking about clothes. In this context, we mean that the warband was made specifically for Warcry, rather than being one of the Age of Sigmar factions. If you have just one box, you're going to go with what you have. The only option seems to be with the leader, but as we saw, the heavy flail is hands above the best choice. If you've already built your leader with the Bident, I'd suggest just running as the heavy flail anyway. If you get 2 boxes, you have a few more options. I'd suggest this as an initial setup. We're playing all the Shatterers we have and all the Flame Hurlers. Everything is relatively cheap, so we're able to take 11 fighters in total. That'll give you a lot of board coverage. I'd keep the Flame Hurlers together, aiming to double up their damage whenever they can. We have 2 of the Ruinators. They're not super exciting, but they are very good. What I love about this warband is that apart from the Ruinators, everyone has reach of 2, so we're forcing our opponent to waste actions to come to us. Now this isn't to say that the Demolishers are bad fighters, but what we are doing here is we're trying to focus on what makes this faction unique. We also have options for allies and trolls. For more on this, check out my Chaos Allies video, and as we've recently gained the Underworlds fighters, there's another video for just those options. For the Horns of Hashut, there really are only 2 choices, Horns or no Horns. We probably want something super dangerous to deal with enemy problems, and the Centaurian Marshal, Ogride Myrmidon, and Doomball all meet the dress code of Horns. Alternatively, we could go with some of the other popular choices, like the Slaughterborn or the Vanguard. When developing your warband, you should keep in mind exactly the kind of battles you're going to be facing. The Horns of Hashut aren't slow, but they aren't particularly fast either, so if you're expecting to play a lot of games where movement will be important, then maybe some fast trolls or allies would help. Similarly, if you're expecting more kill missions, then having something scary could be more important. Another thing to consider is whether you should double down on an existing strength or try cover a weakness. So here we've got the Vanguard, who is a fast and scary fighter, and the Chaos Warhound, who is a cheap but fast troll. They both cover a gap for this warband. On the other hand, the Ogride Myrmidon has reach, which is a strength of the warband, even if he's adding some much needed killing power. The Infernal Raptress is a different take. Her double subtracts 1 from the attacks of enemy fighters near her, so you could combine her with Ash Bomb to create a small bubble, removing 2 dice from enemy fighters. Here's a sample warband. We have 9 fighters in total, so even though we have the expensive Centaurian Marshal, we still have a lot of bodies to cover the board. Everything here is 2 reach or better. The Marshal adds some speed and also has a net ability which is quite nice. Importantly, he's got horns. So hopefully you enjoyed this. While we have focused on the horns here, this is something you should be able to do with your own favourite warband. Look for a niche and go with it. You might find that there isn't anything in particular that your favourite warband is best at, but that's okay too. The most important part is putting together a warband that you'll enjoy playing. Thanks for making it all the way to the end. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Each week I put up a new video talking about one of Games Workshop's specialist games. The goal is always to try and make the best possible 2-player experience. If this is something you'd find interesting, please subscribe to the channel and comment to let me know what you'd like to see in future.